stiff and strong, with little letters looking in Lund so hast been long. Two of the most widely celebrated poetic epics in the English canon come from the Middle Ages, Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The differences between the two are, like many of their similarities, broad and thin in terms of academic application. Questing heroes, blessed arms and armor, great giants and monsters, unnamed poetic authors, etc. But it is when the comparisons begin to draw deeper revelations, and the differences become illuminated through the centuries between their comparisons that a more interesting analysis can be drawn forth. A dual comparison of their linguistic structure and narrative structure reveal the legacies of Old English poetry through the later revivals and additions by Sir Gawain to English epic poetry. Both are in the Middle Ages, but there's a considerable amount of great linguistic shifting that occurs between them. Old English becomes Middle English, new styles emerge. So it is the endurance of these old poetic styles that return in Sir Gawain that are most interesting. Despite the centuries of difference and the great shift in languages that they were first sung, each poem shows a unique approach to poetry within English epics. Because of its age, a great portion of Beowulf's scholarship is particularly tied to its linguistic structure. This is somewhat true for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but to a less significant degree because of its closeness to contemporary English, being only Middle English, and Beowulf's distance from it. E.J. Christie addresses this conundrum with her article on the discourse of Beowulf's own philological nature. Because of its language, you have to actually work to translate it directly. Ultimately, she makes it clear that Beowulf's literary identity is uniquely tied to its linguistic identity, and that despite the poetic value of the language of Old English and the poems written in it, it is somebody else's poetry. Linguistic analysis is not just to make the work of studying Beowulf easier, but it also reveals poetic structures unique to the Old English poetry style that end up being repeated much, much later in Sir Gawain. Specifically, both feature alliteration. Scholars of Old English poetry understand that the use of alliteration, particularly in Beowulf, had a binding function to help guide the orator in the meter. Raphael J. Pasquale describes this effect as because its syntactic units tend to be larger than its metrical lines, alliteration frequently is the only guidance as to whether a given half line is an on or an off verse. So this is more apparent in the original untranslated text of Old English poems, like this segment from Beowulf. Ik thy swine denigai, threin skildinga thrin wil, vega britin swife venea ert, veoden mearn im vin sid. So this alliterative style was briefly revived within the later Middle Ages. Not quite at the Renaissance yet, but definitely now within the Middle English verse. Now, Pasquale describes this new alliterative revival as reminiscent of the Old English alliterative style, which is the case with Sir Gawain. And what's unique about Sir Gawain in this case is that it was also paired with stanza linking, the specific term for that being concatenation, which Eric Weisskott explains is where a word, phrase, or situation repeats from one end of the stanza to the beginning of the next. In narrative poetry, the effect is to suspend, replay, or foreshadow the action. Notably, according to Weisskott, Sir Gawain is the only poem of the period to combine the old alliterative style that was being revived with the new stanza linking, and you can see that in this part right here. He style stiff in stall, full up in that new year, much mirth he was withal, thus there stands in stale the stiff king Hisuluin. Despite the centuries between both works, the effect of the alliteration, especially in Sir Gawain with the inclusion of repetition through concatenation, remains the same as it did during the age of Beowulf, illustrating a greater sense of enduring reverence for the poetry and how these poems were composed. When it comes to specific narrative elements, it is more interesting to compare them and how they are similar through the intended medium, oration. Oral storytelling, a skald, a bard, a traveling poet who's able to speak the words aloud to those who would hear them. The epic poems were not to be read silently, but read aloud in a performance by an orator who would interpret the poems beforehand, much like how a theater company would interpret Shakespeare in a modern production. Joseph D. Sobel describes this process by the orator like so. The teller begins with a written text, whether of her own or another's devising, and commits this text to memory. She then overlays paralinguistic, performative elements of facial, vocal, and kinesthetic expression and timing upon the preset verbal scaffolding, whether in the rehearsal process or in the heat of the performance. With this consideration of the performer of these works, not just the nameless poets who composed both of these works, although that is a matter of academic debate that we do not have time for. The similarity of certain episodes within the works become opportunities for the performer to work with the poetry as they choose. There's a great deal of travel. Both of these are journeying heroes coming to a land. And in this context, how each poem begins is an excellent case for this, because both begin with a similar prologue of the history of their legends. And so how these set the tone for their works and also react to history itself is more intriguing. In Beowulf, the origins of Hrothgar's line, the Geats and the Danes, begin with "So, the spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness." Well, in Sir Gawain, a brief description of Aeneas's descendants following the siege of Troy is the way that the poem begins. This is followed by "Felix Brutus founds Britain on broad banks most grand, and wonder, dread, and war have lingered in that land where loss and love in turn have held the upper hand." Both poems begin with a history of the land as a primer to their works. Even though there is no direct reference to Beowulf, the Geats, or the Danes in Sir Gawain, the poetic styles of Anglo-Saxon Britain have endured in the introductory verses. So even though the individual orator might differ in how they perform, not just both of these works, but even the same work, they both possess a similar structure to at least ground the orator in a similar way of reading these epic poems. They're not moments of grave importance to the story, but they are important for considering and understanding the styles of the poems as they go on. Beowulf and Sir Gawain both deeply revere history and legend, but they do so in completely different ways. Beowulf is contemporary, with consideration for how the past has led us to the present, and the deeds of our ancestors and their artifacts have led the Geats and Danes to where they are now. Now, Sir Gawain makes reference to antiquity, that of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, frequently through direct reference. These do not show a connection of cause and effect, rather a comparison of itself. The situations that Gawain faces are like that of the old Roman legends. Historiography becomes revealed through the way that each poem begins, and thus how each orator will sing it. The language in Beowulf is almost alien compared to that of Sir Gawain. Despite being Old English, it is effectively a language unto itself. While the alliterative revival was itself a revival of a long extensive abandoned practice, its presence in Sir Gawain shows how certain elements endure, even as so much appears to change. Even if certain elements appear to be similar as seeming coincidence, they, in fact, can become representative of enduring practices in oral storytelling that have continued for centuries. That is why this is a video and not an essay to submit. How else can one show how such ideas, like alliteration or an approach to history that grounds it as what came before and thus what brings this poem to bear, how can one else show that other than by engaging and reviving the practice itself? This video is a retelling, in a way. It's its own version of the story. Not the story of Beowulf, but the story of Beowulf.